Love and feelings. Why does romantic love leave us bewitched, bothered, and bewildered? Could it be another paradoxical tactic like handcuffing oneself to railroad tracks? Quite possibly. Offering to spend your life and raise children with someone is the most important promise you will ever make, and a promise is most credible when the promiser can't back out. Here is how the economist Robert Frank has reverse engineered mad love. Unsentimental social scientists and veterans of the singles scene agree that dating is a marketplace. People differ in their value as potential marriage partners. Almost everyone agrees that Mr. or Miss Right should be good looking, smart, kind, stable, funny, and rich. People shop for the most desirable person who will accept them, and that is why most marriages pair a bride and a groom of approximately equal desirability. Mate shopping, however, is only part of the psychology of romance. It explains the statistics of mate choice, but not the final pick. Somewhere in this world of 5 billion people, and actually, of course, now there's 8 billion people, there lives the best looking, richest, smartest, funniest, kindest person who would settle for you, but your dreamboat is a needle in a haystack, and you may die single if you insist on waiting for him or her to show up. Staying single has costs such as loneliness, childlessness, and playing the dating game with all its awkward drinks and dinners, and sometimes breakfast. At some point, however, it pays to set up house with the best person you have found so far, but that calculation leaves your partner vulnerable. The laws of probability say that someday you will meet a more desirable person, and if you are always going for the best you can get, on that day you will dump your partner. But your partner has invested money, time, child rearing, and foregone opportunities in the relationship. If your partner was the most desirable person in the world, he or she would have nothing to worry about because you would never want to desert. But failing that, the partner would have been foolish to enter the relationship. Frank compares the marriage market with the rental market. Landlords desire the best of all tenants, but settle for the best they can find. And renters want the best of all apartments, but settle for the best they can find. Each invests in the apartment. The landlord may paint it the tenant's favorite color. The tenant may install permanent decorations. And so each would be harmed if the other suddenly terminated the agreement. If the tenant could leave for a better flat, the landlord would have to bear the cost of an unrented unit and the search for a new tenant. He would have to charge a high rent to cover that risk and would be loath to paint. If the landlord could evict the tenant for a better one, the tenant would have to search for a new home. She would be willing to pay only a low rent and would not bother to keep the apartment in good shape if she had to expose herself to that risk. If the best tenant were renting the best apartment, the worries would be moot. Neither would want to end the arrangement. But since both have to compromise, they protect themselves by signing a lease that is expensive for either to break. And so by agreeing to restrict his or own freedom to evict, the landlord can charge a higher rent. And by agreeing to restrict her own freedom to leave, the tenant can demand a lower rent. Lack of choice works to each one's advantage. And marriage laws work a bit like leases, but our ancestors had to find some way to commit themselves before the laws existed. How can you be sure that a prospective partner will not leave the minute it is rational to do so? Say when a 10 out of 10 moves in next door. One answer is don't accept the partner who wanted you for rational reasons to begin with. Look for a partner who is committed to staying with you because you are you. Committed by what? Committed by an emotion that the person did not decide to have and so cannot decide not to have. An emotion that was not triggered by your objective mate value and so will not be alienated by someone with greater mate value. An emotion is that is guaranteed not to be a sham because it has physiological costs like tachycardia, insomnia, and anorexia. An emotion like romantic love. Quote, people who are sensible about love are incapable of it, wrote Douglas Yates. Even when courted by the perfect suitor, people are unable to will themselves to fall in love, often to the bewilderment of the matchmaker, the suitor, and the person himself or herself. Instead, it is a glance, a laugh, a manner that steals the heart. Remember from earlier that spouses of one twin are not attracted to the other. If we fall in love with the individual, not with the individual's qualities, The upside is that when Cupid does strike, the love-struck one is all the more credible in the eyes of the object of desire. Murmuring that your lover's looks, earning power, and intelligence quotient meet your minimal standards would probably kill the romantic mood, even though the statement is statistically true. The way to a person's heart is to declare the opposite, that you're in love because you can't help it. Of course, we have the Music Resource Center notwithstanding. And we'll talk about the sneering, body-pierced, guitar-smashing rock musician who is typically not singing about drugs, sex, or Satan. He's singing about love. He is quoting a woman by calling attention to the irrationality, uncontrollability, and physiological cost of his desire. Usually, people do not want any suitor who wants them too badly too early, because it shows that the suitor is desperate, so that they should wait for someone better. And because it shows that the suitor's ardor is too easily triggered, hence too easily triggerable by someone else. The contradiction of courtship, flaunt your desire while playing hard to get, comes from the two parts of romantic love, setting a minimal standard for candidates in the mate market and capriciously committing body to one of them. In terms of the society of feelings, mental life often feels like a parliament within. Thoughts and feelings vie for control as if each were an agent with strategies for taking over the whole person. That is you. Might our mental agents be used paradoxically concerning tactics with one another? For example, the analogy is imperfect because natural selection designs people to compete but does not design organs, including mental agents, to compete. The interests of the whole person are paramount. But the whole person has many goals, like food, sex, and safety, that requires a division of labor among mental agents with different priorities and kinds of expertise. The agents are bound by an entity that benefits the whole person over a lifetime, but over the short term, the agents may outwit one another with devious tactics. Self-control is unmistakably a tactical battle between parts of the mind. Schelling, for example, the philosopher, observes that the tactics people use to control themselves are interchangeable with the tactics they use to control others. How do you prevent your child from scratching his hives in his sleep, or put mittens on him? How do you prevent yourself from scratching your hives in your sleep? Put mittens on yourself. If Odysseus had not plugged his shipmates' ears, they would have done it on their own. The self that wants a trim body outwits the self that wants dessert by throwing out the brownies at the opportune moment when it is in control. So we do seem to use paradoxical tactics against ourselves. The agent in control at one time makes a voluntary but irreversible sacrifice of freedom of choice for the whole body and gets its way in the long run. That is the bright spot in this whole depressing discussion of selfish genes and doomsday machines. Social life is not always the equivalent of global thermonuclear war, because the part of us with the longest view of the future, when in control of the body, can voluntarily sacrifice freedom of choice for the body at other times. We sign contracts, submit to laws, and hitch our reputations to public declarations of loyalty to friends and mates. These are not tactics to defeat someone else, but tactics to defeat the darker parts of our human nature. One more speculation on the battle inside the head. No one knows what, if anything, grief is for. Obviously, the loss of a loved one is unpleasant, but why should it be devastating? Why the debilitating pain that stops people from eating, sleeping, resisting diseases, and getting on with life? Jane Goodall described a young chimp, Flint, who, after the death of his beloved mother, became depressed and died himself, as if of a broken heart. Some have suggested that grief is an enforced interlude for reassessment. Life will never be the same, so one must take time to plan how to cope with a world that has been turned upside down. Perhaps grief also gives people time to contemplate how a lapse of theirs may have allowed the death and how they might be more careful in the future. There may be an element of truth to the suggestion. Bereaved people find that they ache all over again every time they discover another habit to unlearn, like setting out an extra plate or buying groceries for two. And blaming oneself is a common symptom, but the pain of grief makes planning harder, not easier, and is too extreme and long-lasting to be useful as a strategy session. William James, one of the first psychologists and also a philosopher of the 19th century, wrote, quote, "It takes a mind debauched by learning to carry the process of making the natural seem strange so far as to ask for the why of any instinctive human act," end quote. Though legitimate to a scientist, the question, why do we grieve, is preposterous to common sense. If you didn't grieve when someone died, could you really have loved him when he was alive? So it is logically possible, but seems psychologically impossible. Grief is the other side of love, and there may lie the answer. Perhaps grief is an internal doomsday machine, pointless once it goes off. Of course, as you know, if you study any defense policies with all the 9 different countries that have nuclear weapons, of course, anyways, once it goes off, it's useful only as a deterrent. And of course, you guys, everyone knows about deterrence, of course, but once it happens, then deterrence goes out the window. And so, what parents have not lain awake contemplating the horror of losing a child, or worried themselves sick with awful images when a child is late or lost? These thoughts are powerful reminders to protect and cherish a loved one in the face of a myriad of other demands on one's time and thoughts. And like all deterrents, grief would be effective only if it is certain and terrible.